Good afternoon. I'm John Strzenkowski, a retired priest of the Diocese of Brooklyn, and as with most seniors, 1:30 is nap time. So this is a bit of a stretch for me, but nevertheless, I'm sure that our panelists will keep me awake and alert. So our first panelist is Sister Katrina Schutt, who will speak on the newness that Amoris Laetitia brings to us, and as that plays out in terms of priestly formation.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the people who were recognized this morning, Cardinal Supich and Jim Keenan, and also the panelists. And now I can add the wonderful audience, because the questions that you gave were really terrific, and comments. So I'm happy to be speaking about the novelty or the newness and the ingenuity that I believe is very important in the life of priestly and seminary formation as far as Amoris Laetitia and its future in the church. I believe it is important for those who are currently in the seminary and those who have been recently to really understand how they are almost determinative in some ways to see to it that the document will be received in many other circumstances over time by a variety of church members and groups. They need to be the ones who will be willing to see that the laity are involved very much in this discussion. If they keep it to themselves, they will have a very difficult time, considering that the sizes of parishes have gone up so much. There is no way they can deal with 5,000 people in this kind of a discussion and process that is necessary for Amoris Laetitia. So it's really important for them to be able to engage the laity in a critical way to get this document understood. And if Peggy Steinfeld's statistic about 1% have read the document, there's a lot of work to be done in that line. So for the time being, the most practicing Catholics come to understand their faith mainly through homilies and other parish involvements and presentations. And what I'm hearing from priests across the country is getting people to attend something other than Mass, and even that's a challenge, is very difficult because of technology. If you can watch it at home, live streamed, or listen to it later, why would you go out on a bitter cold night in Minnesota, for sure, to say nothing of other parts of the country? So people don't gather, and I think this process requires gathering. So we have a lot of work to do in that kind of background, and that is going to be the job of priests who are in the parishes to get this going, with the help of other pastoral ministers who are so critical to this process as well. So the substance and attitude of this document that they present will make all the difference in whether or not parishes will take this up. So this engagement then in the conversation about the struggles of family life have to come from those who are living family life, the experience of family life day to day, in different ways than we are who are in religious life or priestly ministry. So with that in mind, I will move to the heart of the matter and talk about three dimensions of priestly formation and how it is affected. One is who the seminarians are. And I've been doing this for 35 years, so I have some sense of it. And secondly, who the faculty in the seminaries are. And thirdly, who the bishops are who sponsor the seminaries and who choose to send people to one place or another. So we talked about the four dimensions, that is listening, accompanying, and discerning, and then evangelizing. My sense is that seminarians I have known through the years and heard about from others is that they like to skip to evangelizing, which is not a bad thing in a way. Maybe that is necessary, but I think evangelizing in its richest sense means relationships of all kinds. But unfortunately for them, it is understood as catechizing in the narrowest sense of instructing someone in the principles of Catholic faith, by means of questions and answers. They love questions and answers, especially the answers. So all seminarians are not alike. I want to make that very clear. For example, 25% are international. So think of the added dimension of difficulty in engaging people when they're coming from a culture where they may not have done this as much. For many seminarians, the difficulty with Amoris Laetitia is that it is decidedly not a series of answers to their many concerns and struggles of family life. It is rather challenging. The challenge is learning how to accompany the faithful by engaging with them in the discussion of their concerns and enabling them to form their own consciences regarding these important issues. So it's understanding and accepting that process and getting it in some order that they can actually deal with. So the question that I pose to myself is, what are some of the reasons why seminarians would accept or resist this document? I will mention, as I said, the backgrounds of seminarians, the positions of faculty, and then the expectations of bishops relative to seminary formation. So first of all, the religious and educational backgrounds of seminarians. Many of you will remember Dean Hoagie, who did such wonderful surveys. Kara continues to do surveys that are very good about individual seminarians that involve excellent data. So what we can draw from that is that there are problems in their backgrounds that will make this difficult. And I will give two examples. Actually, at lunch, Archbishop Gregory was saying the very same thing, so he could have given this talk. Some enter seminary with a minimal knowledge of their faith. And often these seminarians practice their faith very little, or they're relatively recent converts from another faith. That is 65%, according to an average of surveys over a period of time. So 2/3 are coming with that. Not that that proportion is coming from other faiths, but that they weren't practicing. They have had a big conversion of some sort, many of them with World Youth Days. It's a little thin, the depth of their faith when they come. I like to think of it as, at best, a mile wide but only an inch deep. And maybe it's really only about 50 yards wide and an inch deep. Understandably, their desire to collect answers, learning as much by rote about the Catholic doctrine, is what they're really after, whatever they can retain that way. This task looms large for someone who in a few years will be the leader of a parish community. And we know we no longer have, in most places, the long apprenticeships of young priests in a parish with an older pastor. Many of them in the Midwest, especially after 2 or 3 years, are becoming pastors, and all over the country. It's not very many years. So their desire is for knowledge that is clear and certain, indisputable and unquestionable. They want to be able to serve their people well. I give them credit for that. We can be very people in general, and myself included at times, can be fairly negative about seminarians, but they are dealing with a lot when they come into a seminary situation. Others, the other 35% or so, have been practicing their faith in devout Catholic families, sometimes homeschooled, 15%, usually in relationships with other young people of like mind who are equally committed and seldom challenged in their faith. At best, this foundation can be useful for the beginning of seminary studies. The difficulty comes when their knowledge is in fact an inch wide and a mile deep. They know a lot about a very little. It leads to a belief that everything about faith is clear and flawless, well-defined and sure. It needs no discussion. From vocation directors, we've learned that most of the seminarians come from this group of millennials now who fit into the category of being highly committed to the church. And again, Kara has done studies on this. 7% of millennials fall into that category. Most of those who enter seminary are in the highly committed category, of course. Their peers, however, are somewhat in the medium category, but in large numbers in the not at all committed. And so their connection between their beliefs and the young people of their age is it's lacking. I teach undergraduates every year, And it's like night and day, and in teaching them. I always think if I could put the two groups together, young Catholics say their major complaint is that there's never time to discuss anything with priests. They always just want to tell us the answer, and we want to talk about it. And some of them don't want, some of the younger priests especially don't want to talk. So that's another, those two groups of people make it very difficult. Now, many of them struggle through this and come out quite able to deal with the issues that we're talking about. And so that notion of being called to form consciences and not to replace them is kind of at the bottom of this, and that's a little bit difficult for some of them. They complain that people do not have a well-founded conscience, so they have to be told what to do. Now, in each case, the presence or absence of certain virtues and qualities that seminarians possess make an enormous difference in their ability to engage in the process required by Amoris Laetitia. Those who succeed have confidence in their ability to converse with parishioners about difficult issues and to encourage parishioners to share their experiences with others. They need a deep academic understanding of the topic, that is, the seminarians, but they also have to have the freedom to engage and be challenged and questioned and confronted. Acceptance of that viewpoint is difficult for those who are fearful that they will misrepresent the church's teaching. And fair enough, they wouldn't want to do that. Or more likely, they hold the position that discussion is impossible or unnecessary since there is only one way to interpret issues. All of this business about looking at the law and trying to find other ways of figuring out how to do things, that's not necessary at all in the minds of some. The idea of development of doctrine is not part of their vocabulary. In the first instance, resistance comes from worry about their own inadequacy, and in the second, the problem of rigidity can sometimes be the issue. Acceptance will be easier for those with both knowledge and heart, that is, compassion and openness to the real lives of people. So moving then to the next level is the faculty. And there have been big changes in faculty over the years. That comment in Amoris Laetitia about making pastors' lives wonderfully complicated to see God's grace work even in situations which might be seen as contrary to doctrinal norms. If faculty introduced that kind of an idea, wonderfully complicated ministry, this would not go over too well. The feeling is that this document is dangerous and confuses people on the part of some. So to the point of the faculty, how they themselves understand the document is important, and what guides the approach they will adopt is another thing I want to say a little bit about. In recent years, faculty composition has been transformed in seminaries. A large cohort of those educated in the years following shortly after Vatican II have retired. Only a handful of current faculty were even young adults at the time of Vatican II. And even the teachers of those who are now teaching in seminaries were in graduate school later in time and largely during the pontificate of John Paul II. Vatican II is not quite the same to them with that kind of understanding. And now I have 2 minutes. So that big change is very difficult then for that faculty to meet those students at that level. And the documents, at the beginning of the program of priestly formation, the first 3 were involved with, largely with the documents of Vatican II. The 4th with Pastoris Dabo Vobis, and the last one with canon law. Those were the guiding citations in those documents. And so the consequence is the faculty have a difficult time. For bishops choosing a seminary or running a seminary, the attitude that they will present will form and shape the way the students come out and the way the faculty will deliver. Obviously, all of this needs more explanation, but the main point I want to convey is that a novelty or the newness of how Amoris Laetitia plays out in priestly and seminary formation will not be univocal. It will vary even within each seminary and will depend a lot on the seminarians, on the faculty, and on the bishops who lead and choose seminaries. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Monsignor John Alessandro from the Diocese of Rockville Center, and he will address the issue of what is the newness that Amoris Laetitia brings to canon law.
Thank you, John. And I appreciate the opportunity, as was a lovely phrase that was used this morning, to use the prism of canon law, not the prison, the prism of canon law to view Amoris Laetitia. For many canon lawyers, Amoris Laetitia was not viewed actually as the most innovative development of the synodal process. It was canonically upstaged by the Pope's promulgation prior to the October 2015 session of a major simplification of the process for declarations of invalidity for both the Latin and the Eastern churches. Some canon lawyers are fearful of those norms, unfortunately, particularly the novelty of a processus brevior in which the diocesan bishop is mirabile dictu, treated as the chief judge, which is what he is. At last year's annual meeting, a group brashly proposed that the CLSA recommend a delay in the implementation of the norms, a resolution that was happily, forthrightly defeated. In fact, this role of the diocesan bishop was strongly emphasized by the 2015 Synod Fathers and Amoris Laetitia itself. Process is important, but the real challenge lies in the substance of marriage law, specifically what qualifies as Christian marriage. Mining the wealth of insights in Amoris Laetitia and implementing them requires the invaluable help of theologians. Yet, Amoris Laetitia does offer canon lawyers some clues and directions for development. On the surface, the document presents a fairly traditional view of marriage, early on distinguishing, for example, marriage and de facto or same-sex unions, and offering a familiar summation about matrimony later on in Chapter 8. In both references, however, there are subtle clues to the development that Amoris Laetitia is emphasizing, the difference between the ideal and practice, between full realization, making real, of the ideal, and partial realization. The interplay between the ideal, the newness that Christ brought to marriage, and realization of that newness in the individual marriage is extremely important for canon lawyers who are dealing day-to-day with realization, either pre-marriage or in tribunal cases. Canon law lies at the descriptive end of Bernard Lonergan's functional specialties, a kind of practical theology and a form of theological communication. Dealing with real-life couples, canon lawyers are challenged by Amoris Laetitia's inductive approach to maintain two forces in tension: the cultural experience of contemporary marriage and the mystery of Christ, in which marriage is immersed. Amoris Laetitia implicitly alerts them, that is, canon lawyers, hold on to the concrete. Do not reduce the specific marriage itself to a cookie-cutter replica of a principle. There is more to mystery than that. That tension, of course, is intense. Pope Francis and Cardinal Mueller certainly approached the meaning of marriage along different paths, yet both have concluded that in the real world, many, if not most, marriages, though presumptively valid in law, are canonically invalid. Amoris Laetitia's emphasis on pastoral discernment, a challenge one might associate initially with confessors and pastoral ministers, applies equally to tribunal judges who want to make a determination about the individual marriage guided by the sacramental meaning of marriage, and yet immersed deeply in the details of this marriage. Even if a specific judgment may not qualify as a general principle, it can still be pastorally discerned as a morally certain decision of nullity in a particular case. For example, Canon lawyers in the past flirted with the idea of relative incapacity as a ground of nullity of marriage. Most shied away from it as too similar to the secular notion of incompatibility. Yet we claim that the unitive property of marriage requires the two spouses to be capable of becoming one. Not one with everyone in the whole world, but specifically with each other. Marriage does not exist in the abstract. It exists only in the individual couple. And Amoris Laetitia's analysis of cultural individualism raises this ground again, in my opinion. The document's inductive approach also counteracts a creeping legalization of canon law that is endemic to practitioners. Lawyers, salvo reverencia, Kathy, like to turn principles, for example, grounds of nullity, into figurative boxes within which the concrete either fits or does not fit. We can construe the facts as far as possible to make them fit, but one never tampers with the frame of the box. Perhaps theologians and pastoral ministers are subject to the same temptation, I don't know. Amoris Laetitia is reminding canon lawyers that while they may be workable in a positive law system, marriage is part of the Christ event. You can never box in the mystery of Christ. To avoid such legalization, Amoris Laetitia does not start conceptually with an abstract definition of marriage, nor even with natural marriage, onto which is grafted the elements of sacramentality and indissolubility. Instead, it identifies the newness of marriage in Christ as the norm, that is, the full realization in contradistinction to partial realization. How does this make a difference for canon lawyers? Let me give you an example. Most tribunal judges treat the due discretion required of spouses identically the same for sacramental and non-sacramental marriages. In a sense, the expert psychiatrist and the judge are supposed to be baptism blind about psychological capacity. Yet, the synodal view suggests that a superior capacity in resolve of the will is required of those entering sacramental marriage than of those entering a non-sacramental union, which is canonically susceptible to dissolution. A corollary of this distinction lies in the synodal concept of domestic church, which you've already heard. The newness of Christian marriage implies the capacity of the spouses to undertake the vocation of becoming a domestic church. That's another way of saying marriage. In preparing couples and deciding nullities, we do not simply study whether the couples are intending marriage per se, but whether they are capable of and intending, at least implicitly, to form a domestic church. In short, spouses must have capacity for the newness of marriage to enter the covenant validly and a willingness to bring about that newness as ministers of that sacrament. This approach raises for canon lawyers the perennial question with which the International Theological Commission, recent popes, and the Roman Rota have struggled, the import of faith on marital consent. To use traditional terminology, the newness of Christian marriage affects the matrimonium in theory, as well as the matrimonium in facto esse. It is not enough for the baptized to consent to a valid natural marriage. There is more to it if they are to become sacramentally and therefore validly one flesh, that is, caught up in the mystery of Christ. Some have suggested that sacramentality simply happens to spouses because they are baptized, even if they don't know it. My reading of the synodal teaching is that sacramentality is a necessary element of their capacity, their intention, and their will. Truly marital consent for them is not posited in a vacuum to which is attached the object of the consent, which happens to be marriage, and for the baptized happens to be a sacramental marriage. In that regard, the final synodal reports and Amoris Laetitia are excellent tools for pre-marriage preparation. Pope Francis's meditation alone on the key words of Corinthians would be an excellent way for them to prepare spiritually and realistically for their loving commitment to each other. The document presents another challenge to canon lawyers. Do not draw too great a distinction between marriage preparation and causes of nullity. Before the wedding, it seems eminently advisable to try our very best to foster the ideals of Christian marriage in our engaged couples. We know that they cannot yet absorb everything, but meeting them where they are, we sincerely trust that we'll be able to help these two spouses sufficiently. But when it comes to making a retrospective judgment about a broken marriage in a tribunal case, some canon lawyers settle for traditional abstract grounds of nullity and rules of evidence, an approach that unfortunately may shortchange the ideal as the true standard of validity. The reality of marriage presented by Amoris Laetitia applies in both directions, going forward into marriage and looking back at the results. The ideal is the norm. The individual marriage is the realization or non-realization, or, I might add, partial realization of it. The science of canon law undergoes cycles, periods of development followed by times of stasis. Amoris Laetitia, I believe, is initiating for canon lawyers a time of development akin to the tremendous insights and applications that occurred in the 20th century regarding the discretion that is necessary and the capacity to assume the obligations of marriage. A development, I might add, that started with concrete cases in individual dioceses, then proceeded into rodal decisions, and then, with the help of concilia documents, found a home in the codes of canon law. Amoris Laetitia crystallizes a call to go beyond these psychological diagnoses about natural marital capacity, I'm getting back to that other distinction, and to apply what we have learned to the paradigm of marriage in the new dispensation, a paradigm that calls for more in the engaged couple's commitment to such a vocation. For example, Amoris Laetitia's view of marital maturity as a process goes far beyond the DSM's definition of immature personality disorder. Tribunal judges are challenged to recognize in individuals and couples, even without a clinical diagnosis, an immaturity that truly made them incapable of positing specifically Christian marital consent. Sometimes incapacity will emerge from the phenomenon Pope Francis terms as technological disconnect. Tribunals are seeing more and more the Google generation, where truth is at the click of a keypad and commitment to the enduring journey of marriage does not compute. All of this, of course, is caught up in the deleterious effect that contemporary tendencies about sexuality have on marital capacity. Sexuality is trivialized and impoverished, not set within the broader framework of an education for love, for mutual self-giving, which is the very essence of marital covenant consent. In the end, the novelty of Amoris Laetitia requires canon lawyers to recognize, in my opinion, religious or pastoral grounds of nullity that are deeper than purely psychological incapacity. They are reasons why the individual marriage may fall short of sacramentality and absolute indissolubility, which is the norm of Christian marriage. All of this is summarized, of course, in the challenge for canon lawyers to take Christian conjugal love seriously. Specifically, Christian love is the core of the marriage bond itself and the root of the covenantal process by which spouses enter marriage. Canon lawyers may find it difficult to get their juridical mind around love if their thinking has become overly legal, which is another way of saying secularized. But they are supposed to be practical theologians, not simply jurists. For example, Amoris Laetitia insists that conjugal love is necessarily marked by tenderness. It is not a nicety, it is essential. It's challenging judges in a tribunal process to discover in the concrete whether both spouses, including the man, were at the time of the wedding truly capable of tenderness in the sense described by the Pope, the tenderness of a mother cradling her infant. A corollary to all of this view is marriage's journey, which is prevalent throughout the document. Spouses must be capable of entering a lifelong adventure and able to renew it constantly if they are to exchange consent validly. It requires that they be friends on the journey. While they do not start out whole and complete, we know that, they must at least be able to grow into this vocation. If they're incapable of that growth or they're really not committed to it, I don't think they're validly married, at least not the Christian marriage. Perhaps I'm, again, reading, this is my final point, I'm too much into it, but it seems to me that the document as a whole supports the idea that as time passes, sacramental marriages become more sacramental and therefore more indissoluble. It may be a very short time or an extended journey. For some, however, although they begin marriage, they never achieve the full sacramentalization that captures the newness of the Christ event in marriage. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Julie Hanlon Rubio from St. Louis University, and how the newness of Amoris Laetitia impacts upon the laity, especially those in second marriages.
I've spent about 20 years writing about marriage and family and mostly staying away from controversial issues. But early in my career, in the early 2000s, when I started teaching classes on marriage, I found I had students coming to me, students whose parents were divorced or in the middle of a divorce. And their pain inspired me to interact with and read and dialogue with social scientists who were writing about the effects of divorce on children. So I think you'll hear some of that in the background of what follows, along with, I hope, also a concern for the pain of adults. Louder? Yes? Okay. Yeah. I begin on August 5th, 2015, when Pope Francis used his general audience to call for mercy for the divorced and remarried. Those persons are by no means excommunicated, he said. Though their situation contradicts the Christian sacrament, it's important that they experience the church as a mother attentive to all, always disposed to listen and encounters. The suggestion is that though those in second marriages are not formally excommunicated, exclusion from Eucharist makes them feel as if they were. The Pope's pleas for mercy and implicitly adaptation in pastoral practice became, I think, to the surprise of many of the laity, the central point of debate in the Synod. Many, though, who expected a clear decision in favor of mercy were disappointed, both by the final document produced by the Synod and Amoris Laetitia itself. But so were many who wanted a clear affirmation of current Catholic teaching and pastoral practice. It seems now that Catholic responses to Amoris diverge on the question of what Catholic lay people need, truth or mercy. Some Catholic writers emphasize how the new pastoral practices that could contradict Catholic teaching on marriage could become a source of scandal. Others stress the healing brought to faithful Catholics by the Pope's insistent refrain, no closed doors, no closed doors. Some worry that the teaching on indissolubility is being eroded, and they point legitimately to increasing acceptance of divorce that has led first to a steep increase in annulment and then to a significant decrease as more Catholics divorce and remarry outside of the church. Others who see brokenness in marriages they know are concerned, in contrast, that so far mercy has only inspired minor changes in liturgical practice and not greater moral acceptance of divorce itself, as more and more Catholics walk away from a church wedded, in their view, to a church whose teachings seemed untethered to reality. Amoris Laetitia is more complex than these debates allow. The newness of AL, I think, of Amoris for the laity, especially those in second marriages, lies not only in mercy but also in truth, in its strong vision of marriage as deeply personal, lifelong, outward-facing union of two imperfect but committed people. And the challenge of receiving it is going to be figuring out how to keep the mercy and the truth together. So first, the messiness, divorce, reality, and mercy. For Catholics remarried without an annulment because they thought they couldn't receive one, the newness lies in the possibility of inclusion brought about by changes in the process we just heard some about. Already, a recent study shows increases in the number of annulment requests in many dioceses after years of decreases, and no diocese surveyed showed a decrease. Francis's annulment reforms may be especially important in immigrant parishes, where the current annulment process prevents particular difficulties when spouses are in different countries, hard to locate, etc. When the Pope insists that no one can be condemned forever and offers a merciful path back to full inclusion, there are many out there who are rejoicing. However, many, maybe most Catholics in second marriages don't feel annulment fits their situation. It seems unlikely that even Eve's procedures will lead a majority down that path. In cases where no annulment is possible, perhaps Amoris offers a second merciful path back via discernment. And some priests who were waiting for this document now feel empowered to reach out and open up new possibilities for people in their parishes. The advantages of the new path are real: respect for conscience, an invocation to adult faith, and perhaps even a recognition that, as Margaret Farley has argued, because love is both emotion and will, it's fragile, which is both why we promise and why we can't make promises ultimate. Many in second marriages welcome recognition of the reality of their finitude and affirmation of their fidelity in their new families. The responsibilities of living into these new possibilities in second marriages, with or without annulments, are serious. Some argue against this path. How can the reality of the first marriage be ignored? Because of God's grace, one theologian argues, the ontological reality never dies. Something of the marriage remains. In Amoris, Pope Francis encourages couples to consider whether a crisis in their marriage can become an apprenticeship in growing closer together, while anticipating the need for parish communities to accompany those who can't stay together. Perhaps part of accompanying people in or considering second marriages will be helping them to ask really hard questions. And I envision this helping to be not just priests, but also the laity in the parishes. Questions like, how did I experience God joining me to my first spouse? Could God have been present in times of crisis, even when we couldn't see? Where is God now in relation to us? Does anything of our marriage remain, even if significant parts have died? Where do I experience God's grace and mercy in the second union? Is this now where I'm meant to be? Receiving Pope Francis's teaching means balancing merciful recognition of human finitude and grace found in new paths with a willingness to look back unflinchingly at what was lost and to mourn what was left behind. But the newness of Amoris is not only in opening new paths, but in giving a more compelling account of what marriage is at its core, at its best. Francis's move to speak directly to couples about their lives, especially in the 4th chapter of Amoris, is profound. John Paul II tried to do the same via his theology of the body and his 4 tasks of the family and Familiaris Consortio, but perhaps his philosophical and theological training and excellence got in the way and limited his reach. Francis builds on this foundation, but utilizes his pastoral skills to good effect, providing a vision designed to answer real questions that people have, such as, why get married at all? Why promise to stay married for life? What does it mean to work on marriage? What is the point of staying married if it's not making us happy? Given declining marriage rates in most parts of the world and global divorce rates, which are, in some parts, global divorce rates, which are leveling off in some places, but still high and even increasing among older couples, these questions need answering. Francis insists that deep, lifelong love is what human beings are made for. This promise to love another person forever, he says, protects and shapes a shared commitment to deeper growth. Central to his vision is the goodness of love and intimacy, both of which need to be cultivated if a marriage is to be sustained. Through inevitable disappointments, couples are called to embrace the joy of love, which can be experienced even in the midst of sorrow, he claims. In marriage, 2 individuals become partners, companions on life's journey who promise to be there for each other forever, not just until. Embedded in this vision is a strong sense of the social nature of marriage. Love overflows in children, who he says should be raised to look beyond self-absorption, but also in the social mission of the family. Together, a married couple is much more than 2. They're called to bind the wounds of the outcast, to foster a culture of encounter, to fight for justice. That's a vision of marriage that is worth signing up for, worth fighting for. For married couples and those who are thinking about marriage or afraid of it, Amoris can be a challenging source of reflection if we make room for it in our parishes. Already, parishes around the country are transforming their marriage preparation programs to ready couples for the kind of marriage Francis speaks of, with longer programs, mentor couples, and a focus on accompaniment. Possibilities for marriage renewal and education, which has been in the decline in the U.S. since the heydays of Marriage Encounter and the Christian family movement, are just beginning to explore, and so far they're pretty much limited to upper middle class populations. With poignant descriptions of married couples going deep and reaching out and staying true to each other, even when Francis offers a vision that can inspire and redirect. For couples living in second marriages, the vision of Amoris can be both inspiring and challenging. Inspiring for the marriage they're in as they ponder how to become more married along with everyone else, but challenging if a first marriage was left behind too quickly. In addition, it'll be important to consider alongside this vision the complexity of second marriages. Certainly many are grace-filled, life-giving for both spouses and children, creating new ties and obligations. However, the social science data gives us a more sobering portrait. They're usually entered into after periods of dating which involve instability for both children and adults. They're more likely to end in divorce than first marriages, 60 versus 40%. The outcomes for children don't differ significantly than those for children in single-parent families, which are troubling, even when finances aren't an issue. In short, those in second marriages will want to consider how their experiences may reflect both the reality of love and grace so beautifully testified to in Amoris, and the difficulties we know from the social science, and maybe both and. Married couples considering divorce would benefit from placing the vision of Amoris for marriage alongside the social science data on divorce, and there's a lot to be said here, but just a few things. There's some data suggesting that attempts to treat crises in marriage are woefully inadequate. For instance, many marriage counselors don't have extensive training in couples counseling, and this limits their practice. Most Catholic parishes lack capacities for counseling or supporting couples in crisis, and most couples don't go there to get help. Many couples don't receive the support they need from friends and family either. Focusing only on mercy and Amoris may result in too narrow an emphasis on whether or not an exception to the rule applies. Engaging the fuller picture allows for deeper questions like, how serious is the suffering we're experiencing? How sure are we that our current suffering will continue? Do we have capacities beyond our imagining? Is growth possible or not? Who will suffer if we part? Even if we may divorce, should we? Catholic communities charged with supporting the vision of Amoris have to ask what they can do, how they can contend with the social forces working against the forming and sustaining of marriage. How can we reshape expectations about marriage? When divorce is a risk, can we help couples discern well? When divorce happens, can we carve out time and even liturgical space to acknowledge both its tragic and healing aspects? Can we help those involved grieve and heal? Can we encourage better practices around divorce and post-divorce family relations? And through all of this, can we testify to our high value on marriage as well as unfailing mercy for those who cannot stay true to the vows they made? The newness of Amoris for the laity lies both in mercy and truth. For those in second marriages, I hope its push for inclusion and respect for moral discernment opens up new paths back to the church. But I also hope its rich vision of lifelong marriage inspires more struggling couples to hang in there, not out of fear, but out of hope and a desire for the deep, generous, enduring relationship that Francis talks about. And I hope Catholic parishes will be inspired to go beyond marriage prep and 25th and 50th anniversary dinners, helping couples deepen their marriages, helping them ask hard questions when they're contemplating divorce, and if divorce and second marriage are the best possible option, helping them find their way back to their parishes to sit alongside the other sinning saints gathered around the table.
Our next speaker is Monsignor Philippe Bourdain from as rector of l'Institut Catholique, and he will inform us how this newness of Amoris Laetitia is playing out in France.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
That's
First of all, I want to express my gratitude to Cardinal Supich and to Professor Jim Keenan for this invitation. Introduction. I would say there is a new process involving bishops, priests, theologians, and people. I must mention the commitment of the office, family, and society of the French Conference of Bishops. It has been remarkable. Especially the chair, Bishop Brunin, has been extremely courageous. The objective was to have as many people as possible discover Amoris Laetitia. This office prepared a commentary written by 20 theologians, male and female, belonging to a large spectrum of theological institutions. The book also contains a guide dedicated to ease further reading and discussion in parishes. Around 10,000 books have been sold so far, which in France is a large number for religious books. The background of this paper is my experience in diocesan formations I have been invited to organize in 12 French dioceses, mostly at the bishop's initiative, often with the cooperation of the Presbyteral Council. I have always been asked to focus on chapter 8, but I have each time started with an overview of the synod process led by Pope Francis and of the theological impulse of Amoris Laetitia. If I summarize this impulse, I would say as a theologian, the Church is to serve God's action in the life of people who love and are faithful, always with their own limitations. Very important word. Always with their own limitations. In one diocese, the formation was addressed to representatives of parish councils, but usually it was reserved to priests, with the participation of deacons and lay people in charge of the pastoral of families and the diocesan officiality. About one half of the 93 dioceses of France have had such formations. Number one, people. People most often express the joy of discovering a papal document that is readable by non-specialists, that deals with the experience of human sexuality, that tells the beauty of love with ordinary words. I would not say for the whole book, but the indication is to start with, for ordinary people, with chapter 4 and chapter 5. And it works. Those who are more accustomed to theology notice the Pope's call to avoid a discourse of the ideal disconnected from the concrete, and the call to respect the conscience of the concrete persons who deal with concrete difficulties. They appreciate that the analogy between human marriage and the union of Christ with his church, Ephesians 5, is clearly designated as being always imperfect. Amoris Laetitia 122. They also note that a lay person, not only a priest, and that's the difference between the synod and what the Pope wrote, that a lay person, not only a priest, may be the right partner in the process of discernment in which the divorced and remarried persons are themselves to be actively involved. Number 312. Many married people express their joy and pride of discovering that Francis makes no taboo about aggressiveness, difficulties of relation within the couple or between parents and children, domestic violence, marriage failure, divorce, divorced and remarried persons, homosexuality. No taboo. That's a change. In France, there is a general feeling that more could have been said in Amoris Laetitia, that's some regret. More could have been said on not chosen celibacy, on people who deeply suffer from remaining single, on couples who cannot have children. However, so what I've been saying is very positive. However, I must confess that there is a gap between those who approve of the Pope showing pastoral understanding towards family matters and those who fear that the Pope might be fueling relativism by admitting that many people live in gray situations without being deprived from God's grace. In the second category, there is quite a number of young, highly committed Catholics who expect from the Pope a rhetoric of the ideal rather than a realistic view on the real situation of families. And I agree with many things that Sister Katharina has been saying about seminarians. Second, priests. A gap that is similar to that among the lay people is noticeable among priests. Some of them, I quote one of them, some of them have expected such pastoral changes for years. One of them said for 35 years. Especially the more inclusive approach to divorced and remarried. Those priests do not appreciate pastoral mercy, do not only, appreciate pastoral mercy, but they appreciate also a realistic approach towards human fragility and towards the people we need to welcome or to keep within the church, especially parents who are the first actors for transmitting the faith. I quote Amoris Laetitia 66, "Every family, despite its weakness, can become a light in the darkness of the world." This is a perspective of mission. On the contrary, other priests, talking of the gap, especially the youngest, fear the lack of doctrinal safety in such pastoral approach, even if they approve of a discourse on concrete family situations. Many of them have been raised in divorced families or patchwork families, and they have entered priesthood with a high ideal, probably too high an ideal, of helping couples to reach stability and spiritual achievement in families. One must also mention a small number of priests who, by principle, would never attend a formation on Amoris Laetitia. They simply don't show up in diocesan formations. Small number, but it does exist. In both groups, my feeling is that the reaction remains very emotional in both groups. The challenge is to have both groups enter the text of Amoris Laetitia beyond their own representations of what family life and what pastoral of families should be. My experience is that a careful reading is facilitated when it is preceded by an engaged sharing on pastoral cases, avoiding to start with difficult cases. It is preferable indeed to start in a way that is congruent with the major theological impulse of Amoris Laetitia, positively paying attention to the action of God's grace in people's life, whatever their marital situation. In so doing, priests are challenged in their capacity for admiration rather than in their disappointment before fragility or in their fear of betraying God's will. I would say as a theologian, conscience is capable. Conscientia capax, cum limites. But conscience is capable. Fragility requires our care for integration, but not our despair nor our judgment. God knows our fragility better than we do, and He has saved the world through the death and resurrection of Christ. The mission of the Church is to accompany this redeeming process and to involve the recipients of salvation in the process rather than excluding them. The help of the Church is due to people who live. The help of the Church is due to people who live in grace situations. Otherwise, the gracious action of God is despised. I quote number 205. By thinking that everything is black and white, we sometimes close off the way of grace and of growth and discourage paths of sanctification which give glory to God. End of quote. Third, my own interpretation of these facts. In order to serve the reception of Amoris Laetitia in the long run, I think it is necessary to clarify that Francis's change in moral reasoning is the clue to the change in sacramental discipline and pastoral discipline, for cohabitation, for instance. The major resistance against Amoris Laetitia probably comes from laity and priestly moral formation that is more doctrinal and intellectual than pastoral and exposed to discernment in complexity. I wonder whether and how case studies is being practiced in seminaries regarding confession and spiritual direction. I suspect that priestly moral formation has been more focused on repeating the papal teaching of St. John Paul than on introducing to varied moral traditions within the church history. Consequently, it makes it more difficult for priests to receive Francis's teaching as faithful to tradition, as long as it departs from an ethics of law and revitalizes freedom and virtue ethics. We have to read chapter 7 on moral education of the youth. There's nothing about law. Not that Pope Francis despises law, but he believes that education of freedom and formation of good habits is the clue. One should not forget that moral theology was born in the 18th century within the pastoral practice of confession, Alphonse Maria de Ligori, to facilitate the growth of people in the reception of God's grace on their way to salvation. And still, in the first half of the 20th century, continuous formation of priests trained them in pastoral discernment by discussing confession cases in local sessions under the authority of the dean. When I have time on Sundays, I check the Amis du Clergé, beginning of the 20th century. It's very interesting because there are cases that are discussed. My experience is that today, priests suffer from being isolated in their pastoral discernment, which may increase their fear of being wrong or unfaithful in guiding the persons. This requires places where every priest can speak freely and be respected in the views and questions he formulates. The contribution of laity who have experienced that their conscience has shed light upon complex situations would be helpful to them. Learning to read a text is a real challenge, especially when it aims at practicing discernment instead of producing sharp judgments. I take an example. At the end of the session, a young priest asked me, why did the Pope write the content of footnote 351 in a footnote and not in the main text? Excellent question. I deal with the footnote, but the rules of interpretation certainly tell that the main text is more important than the footnote. Here, what does the main text say? It says that the assistance of the church is required so that people can love and grow in God's grace when they are not subjectively culpable or not fully, although they live in an objective situation of sin. 305. This means that the most important question to raise in the church is the following: how can we give assistance to sinners who are in a process of conversion and change? In other words, who are entering the state of grace, so that they can better cooperate with God's grace. This question is obviously faithful to the gospel and to Jesus' way of doing. Pope Francis denounces those who consider that some situations regarding law exonerate the Church from giving her assistance. The question of sacramental assistance through penance and the Eucharist at the end of a serious process of discernment takes place in this larger frame. This is why Francis develops a deep theological discourse on the divine grace and on the growing process it makes possible for people encountering various sorts of difficulties. This provokes the astonishment of many around, as is the case in the Gospel when Jesus let the sinners be part of the movement of renewal inaugurated by his preaching the kingdom of God. Thank you very much.